In this episode, I'm going to talk about logging in database for Blazor WebAssembly application. So when we created Blazing Chat application, we created it as a ASP.NET Core hosted version of Blazor WebAssembly application, where we have a client project and a server project. And because of that, we could face errors to different places. We could face errors on the client side, on Blazor components, and on the server side, we could face errors on our controllers. So when we push our application into the production, we don't want to show these errors to our end user, not in these detailed formats. Also, when we are facing exceptions on our server side, we don't want to just forget about them. We would like to log them in the database so that we could monitor these exceptions and get rid of them. So I've given myself a head start and I've created a table called as logs. Whenever I'm getting these exceptions, I would like to log that information in the table so that I could go over this table and see when a particular exception happened and where it happened. From stack trace. We could get the message, we could get the source, where it happened on the server side or on the client side. We could get the event name and the log level. So I've created this table. If I open my DB viewer, you can see that I have this logs table. It's empty right now. It has log ID, log level, event name, source, exception message, stack trace, and created date, so that we could capture the exceptions which are happening on the server side and on the client side. I have also scaffolded this table. That means I've created a model for that, a partial class log, and I have also updated my DB context. I'm using Entity Framework Core in order to store these logs in the database. So I have updated my DB context too. On top of that, I have thrown a couple of exceptions on contacts controller. Whenever I'm trying to get contacts count, I'm throwing index out of range exception. That's on the server side. And on the client side, we are assuming that we'll get an exception on settings component. Whenever we are loading our component, we are throwing null reference exceptions. So let's go ahead and first see these exceptions, how they're getting logged in our terminal and in our client browser. So I'm going to do .NET run, and that should run my application. I'm going to go to my browser and then go to application. So I'm going to log in into my application and it works fine. But if I go to my contacts page, then you can see that I'm getting an exception. And in the terminal, I can see that I got an exception, index out of range exceptions, on get contacts count method on line number 56. So it's getting logged in the terminal, and there is something getting logged in my browser too, but it doesn't tell me where the exception is happening on the server side. It will tell me on client side where the exception happened, but it won't tell me on what method you're getting exception on the server side. We would also store this in our log so that we can see what's happening on the client side too. I'm going to clear this, and on the settings page, we threw an exception. On settings page, we threw null reference exception. So whenever I get that exception, that gets logged in my browser, and it says object reference not set to an instance of an object, and this is where you're getting the error, and nothing happens on the server side. So we would like to log the error which is happening on the client side and on the server side. I'm gonna shut down my application. Now let's get started with server side and log the errors which are happening on the server side. For that, I'm going to go to my server project. And here I have the startup class, which configures my services, and it also configures my logging too. To configure that, I'm going to get that as a parameter here. I'm going to say logger factory. Name it as logger factory. I'll have to bring in a namespace here. Now, by default, ASP.NET Core adds 4 providers. And when I say providers, that means you're telling your application where to log errors or information or warning, whatever log level that is, where you would like to log that. You can log that in console, debug, event log, and I think event source. I might be wrong here. So these are the 4 places where ASP.NET logs information by default, depending on what log level that you have set. But on top of these, you can add your custom providers too. And that's what we are going to do now. We are going to add a custom logging provider, which is going to log information into the database. So if I say logger factory, and then I'm going to use this add provider method, you can see that it takes iLogger provider as parameter. So we'll have to create a class which can log information in the database, which will be of type iLogger provider. So let's go ahead and create that folder. I'm going to create a folder, which I'm going to name as login. And I'm going to add a class here, which is going to be application logger provider. This is the provider for our application. This will have a namespace, which will be placing chat.server.logging. And this will have a class, which will be application logger provider. Now this class will implement a log because we saw that it was taking iLogger provider as a parameter. So I'm gonna implement this class, implement this interface here, which is iLogger provider. I'm going to have to bring in a namespace here, which will be Microsoft extensions logging, and I'll have to implement this interface too. Now, this interface wants us to handle 2 methods, and both of them are throwing exceptions. So I'm going to first remove that. And it has one method which is creating the logger, and this is the method gets called whenever you're providing a logger to an instance which can use that logger which is injected in it for logging. So when I go to my controllers, you can see that it has a logger. So this is the logger which will log database, which will log errors into the database or whatever logger providers that you're providing. So we'll have to create that. First, I'm going to have to create a database logger which can implement iLogger. So I'm going to create a class which I'm going to name as database logger, and it will have a namespace which will be blazing chat.server.logging. I thought that's what I added here. Logging. Okay. Now, in the database provider, we'll have to first create a class, which is going to be a public class, and its name is going to be database logger, which is going to inherit from iLogger, because whenever we add this application logger, it will ask for the logger, and we need to create a class which can inherit from iLogger. We'll have to bring in a namespace here, and we'll have to implement an interface. This interface is also throwing some exceptions, so I'm gonna just handle this exceptions for now. Let's return null as of now and return true for now, and we can work on this later. But in this logger, I have this method log, which gets called whenever your application is trying to log something. So we'll have to insert a record in the database whenever this method gets called. Now here, I'm going to create an instance of log. You can see we created a log model. And I would like to create an instance of this and then add this instance into my database. So let's go ahead and create an instance. So I'm going to say log, which is going to be log new. And we'll have to bring in a namespace here, which is going to be Blazor server models, so that we can grab that model. Now here, I'm gonna add some columns. You can see that we have log level, event name, source, exception message, stack trace, and created date. So I'm gonna add a log level first, which I can get from this log level. I'm gonna add some log level, which I can get it from toString. And I can also add some event name from this event ID. So I'm going to say event name is equal to event ID dot name. We can also get some exception. So you can see that it's catching an exception. So I'm going to say exception message is equal to exception. I can check if it's null or not, and then get the message from the exception. And then we can also store stack trace and check again if the exception is null or not, and then get the stack trace. We can also store its source, where the exception is happening. Is it happening on the server side or client side? We could get that, and we can also set the created date too. So I'm going to set log, and here I'm going to first set source, which will be server, because we are doing this on the server project. And I'm going to also set created date, which is going to be datetime.now.toString, so that you can go back in time and see when a particular exception had happened in production when you push this application. So now I would like to log this. I would like to insert this in the database, and you can see that we don't have a DB context here. So we're going to need to get that from our startup class. So wherever we're adding a provider, this is where we're going to need the DB context from. So I can pass new application logger provider here. It was asking for it. I can add a using statement for that. So I added a provider, but provider is creating a database logger. We created a database logger, which is going to log in the database. And I'm going to return that new database logger. But even after adding these providers, I'm not really inserting the data in the database because we do not have DB context. So let's get that DB context first. And we are adding that DB context as one of the services in our startup class. And I would like to get this DB context. For that, I'm going to use application services from this app parameter. I'm going to use app.application services, and which is going to create a service provider, and I'm going to grab that service provider, and from that service provider I'm going to get my DB context. So let's store that service provider, and then I'm gonna get service provider get required service, which will be of Blazing chat context type. So I can get the application's DB context, and then I can pass this DB context to my application logger provider. So I'm going to pass that here, DB context, but there isn't any constructor which takes that. So let's go ahead and create that constructor. So I'm going to say ctr, and here I'm going to expect Blazing chat context, and I'm going to assign that to a read-only local property. First, let's get the namespace and add a read-only property, and then pass that context to our database logger. I'm gonna go to my database logger, and then here also I'm gonna create a constructor which can take Blazing chat context, which could be assigned to a read-only property here. So you can see that we got the application DB context from one of the services, and we passed those to our application logger provider, which is actually a database logger, which can also have access to Blazing chat context. Now I can add this log to my logs. This is how you insert a record into database using entity framework. And I'm going to save that in the database. So now our application is ready to log information into database from server side at least. Let's go ahead and run this and see if that works or not. I'm going to, let's clear this. Clear. I'm going to say .NET run. So this will set up a logger for me on the server side, which will log this information in the database. So if I go to my logs now, you can see that there are 5 entries, which all of them are information which are created just now. They weren't exceptions. There wasn't any stack trace. And if you look at my terminal here, you can see that I have 5 information entries which are getting logged in the console too. So these are the entries which are logged here. Now I'm gonna go to my application, and then we are going to access our contacts page, because that's where we are throwing exception on the server side. So I'm gonna click on contacts. You can see that there was an error on the client side. If I refresh this, it will add that error in my database. It will set an event name, it will set the source, exception message, and then stack trace. I can look at the stack trace from this panel. You can see that. Let me just copy that. I'm gonna close this. I'm gonna copy the stack trace and put it in my notepad. Then you can see that the error happened on the controller on the server side on contacts controller.cs line number 56. So if I go to my server project and open my controller, which is contacts controller, and go to line number 56, you can see that there was an exception thrown, which was index out of bound, which is getting stored in the message. So if I go back to my exception message and then put it on the top here, you can see that the exception message says index was out of bound of the array. So this is how you can log information for the server. Let's try to do the same thing for the client. You can see that we did get an error on the client, but that did not get logged. This was a different error. This was response status code does not indicate success error. This did not get logged, but we would like to log this. For that, I'm gonna first stop my application, and then we are going to need these two classes, application logger provider and database logger, in our client project too. And then we don't have DB context there, but we'll have HttpClient, so that I can call this controller that I've created, logs controller, which will post logs from an API to the database. So we can use this controller to log on logs which are happening on the client side in the database. So I'm gonna copy this folder, literally copy this folder, and then paste it in my client project. I'm gonna have to change few things here. First is we don't have access to the server namespaces, but we do need the models. Maybe we don't need the models in application logger. I'm gonna remove that. We don't have blazing chat context here. We don't create DB context on the server, on the client side. We do create that on the server side. I'm going to remove that. I'm going to remove this too. On the database logger, the model is in the shared project now. So if I go to my shared project, I created this log model so that it could access that on the client project too. So I'm gonna remove that, and then I'm gonna remove this blazing chat context. We are not saving anything directly from the client side. We will use HttpClient for that. So we added application logger in startup class, in our startup class. But for our client project, we do not have start class. We have program.cs, and this is where you can add your loggers. So for adding loggers, I'm going to go to my program.cs, and here I'm going to add a builder. I'm going to add a logger, actually a logger provider. And we'll have to change namespaces here. Hang on. So this application logger provider and database logger provider, they are in the client project. So I'm going to change this namespace to client and this namespace to client too, so that we could access those application logger providers and loggers on our program.cs. So now I'm in program.cs of client, and here I can add services, and one of the services is going to be logging, and you can configure logging here. So just like we added provider on the server project, I'm adding provider here too by using this logging, which is a logging builder, and I'm gonna add a provider here, which is going to be new application logger provider. So which is going to be new application logger provider. I'll have to bring in a namespace here. I'm gonna add that. Now we have added that application provider, but we do need HttpClient so that we could call web API to add this record into the database. So in database logger, we're going to need HttpClient. So let's get started from our program.cs and pass HttpClient, which is a scoped service in our application logger provider. For that, I'm going to use builder.services build service providers and then get required services, which is going to be HttpClient. So it will give me a HttpClient service, and then we can pass that in our application logger provider. Let's go ahead and fix the constructor to take HttpClient and we can assign that to a read-only property here. See how fast I get code. And then I'm gonna go to my database logger and then create a read-only property, add a namespace for HttpClient, and create a read-only property for HttpClient. Now I can use that HttpClient to log this information using my controller on the server side. I'm going to call this post log API. For that, I'm going to use HTTP post as JSON. We're going to need an extension method for that. I'll add that in a minute. And we are going to push that to logs, and the instance that I would like to push that is this that I'm creating on the client side. And we'll change the source to client because we would like to see that in our source here in the database column. Now we'll have to bring in an extension method, which is going to be HttpJSON, I believe, system.net HttpJSON, so that we could pass this object as JSON over the web API. Now let's go ahead and run our application and see if everything, which is, we'll have to bring in a namespace for this, I believe. Yeah. So everything which is happening on the client side and on the browser side is going to get logged in the database. I'm going to clear this and then run it again. Now I'm going to delete my logs, and then you can see that there isn't anything in my logs anymore. I'm going to go to my local host, log in with John Smith, go to contacts page, and I'm facing the error. If I run this query again, you can see that there is now an error happening on the server side. There's an error happening on the server side, which is index outbound. It is also logging what's happening on the client side. You can see the source difference here. So the error which we were facing, which was 500, did also get logged. If I go to my settings page where we are throwing that null reference exception, if I go to my settings page here, I'm throwing a null reference exception. If I go to that page, then it throws that exception, and it also gets logged in my database too. And it also tells me the start trace for it. So this is how you can log information from client side and from server side. Now, we don't want to log everything. There were so many other details too, like information, warnings, and everything. You can fix that by setting your log level to error, or whatever you want to, how much information that you want. Now it is set to information. So anything which is more than information, like warning or errors or critical, everything is getting logged. But we can change that to error for all the categories here. And on the client side, we can change the logging. We can set minimum level, log level to error. So only the errors which are happening on the client and server side will get logged in the database, or anywhere actually. I'm gonna clear this clear, and I'm gonna do a .NET clean because sometimes it does not work right when we change the app settings. And then I'm gonna run my application, and you can see that there will be only warnings which are getting logged here, and nothing else will get logged because you have set the minimum log level to error. Only errors will get logged. So if I go to my application and go to contacts page, you can see that there wouldn't have been any logs related to information. This must have been because the app settings which was not loaded. I'm going to remove that. Okay, so now if I go to if I refresh this page and then look at the logs, there isn't anything. And if I go to my contacts page, then you can see that there was an error and that did get logged. Only that thing got logged in my table here. And you can see that there were some client information related log levels which are not showing right now. They're only showing the errors which are happening on the server side and on client side. And it also gives you the stack trace. If I go to my settings page where we were throwing error only on the client side, that will get logged without any other information. It will get logged as object reference not set to an instance of an object at this location. So this is how you can log errors and exceptions in your database when you push this application to the production. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook, or you can ask those questions in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.